A married couple was sitting on the couch after a long day. The husband said, "Honey, marriage is all about teamwork." The wife said, "Exactly, so get up and bring me the blanket." He said, "That's not teamwork." She said, "It is if you're on my team." A wife asked her husband, "Do you remember what today is?" The husband panicked internally. He said, "Of course I do." She said, "What is it then?" He said, "It's a very special day." She stared at him. He stared back. Finally, she said, "It's garbage day, take out the trash." He whispered, "Oh, thank goodness." A couple went out to dinner. The waiter asked, "Would you like sparkling or still water?" The wife said, "Still." The husband said, "Sparkling." The waiter asked, "So which one?" The husband said, "It doesn't matter, she always gets what she wants." The wife said, "Correct." A husband asked his wife, "Why do you always walk so fast when we're at the mall?" She said, "Because if I slow down, you'll escape." A woman told her husband, "I had a dream you bought me a diamond necklace." She said, "What do you think it means?" He smiled and said, "You'll find out tonight." She was excited all day. That evening, he handed her a small wrapped box. She opened it and found a book titled The Meaning of Dreams. A wife asked her husband, "If I go missing, would you look for me?" He said, "Of course I would." She said, "What would you do first?" He said, "Check the fridge." She said, "Why the fridge?" He said, "Because that's where you hide when you're mad." A couple was arguing about directions while driving. The wife said, "Turn left." The husband turned right. She shouted, "I said left." He said, "I heard you, but the car felt right." The wife said, "You and the car are both wrong." A husband tried to fix a broken cabinet. He hammered, tightened screws, muttered to himself, and made things worse. His wife watched and said, "You know, professionals exist." He said, "I am a professional." She said, "At making new problems." A wife told her husband, "You never listen to me." He said, "That's not true." She said, "Okay, what did I just say?" He said, "Something about feelings." She said, "Wrong, very wrong." A couple was trying to choose a movie. She said, "Let's watch something romantic." He said, "Let's watch something with explosions." They watched a romantic movie where a building exploded once. Both said, "Perfect." A wife said to her husband, "I'm cold." The husband said, "Then put on a sweater." She glared at him. He sighed, got up, grabbed a blanket, wrapped her up and said, "Sorry, I forgot the correct answer." A husband proudly told his wife, "I cleaned the whole kitchen." She looked around and said, "All you did was put one plate in the dishwasher." He said, "Yes, and that plate was holding the whole kitchen together." A wife told her husband, "We need to communicate more." He said, "I agree." There was silence for 10 seconds. She said, "Say something." He said, "Something." She said, "I regret everything." A couple went to a fancy restaurant. The husband asked, "Do we have to order appetizers?" The wife said, "No, but we can." He said, "Do we need dessert?" The wife said, "No, but we will." A wife said, "Honey, do you think I'm high maintenance?" The husband froze. He froze so hard that time itself paused. Then he said, "What does high maintenance mean to you?" She said, "Nice try." A couple was assembling furniture together. The wife read the instructions slowly. The husband said, "Let's just build it. Who needs instructions?" 20 minutes later, the furniture looked like modern art. The wife said, "Congratulations, you invented a chair table shelf thing." A husband said, "I bought something to help us communicate better." His wife got excited. He handed her 2 walkie-talkies. She stared at him in disbelief. He said, "Over." She said, "We're done, over." A wife asked her husband, "Why do you blink so loudly when you lie?" He said, "I don't lie. Blink, 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 blink." She said, "Exactly." A couple was shopping for paint colors. The husband pointed at one and said, "This one looks white." The wife said, "That's not white, it's frost mist harbor moonlight." The husband said, "That's just white with extra words." A husband tried to help with the laundry. He put clothes in, didn't sort anything, and set the cycle to mystery. When the clothes came out pink and half shrunk, the wife said, "What did you do?" He said, "I added creativity." A wife said to her husband, "You're lucky I love you." He said, "I know." She said, "You're supposed to say something back." He said, "You're also lucky you love me." She said, "That's not how this works." A couple was eating dinner when the wife said, "Honey, do you think I talk too much?" The husband said, "Do you want an honest answer?" She said, "No." He said, "Perfect." A husband proudly said, "I solved the mystery." His wife asked, "What mystery?" He said, "Where all the forks keep disappearing." She asked, "Where are they?" He said, "In the car." She said, "Why are the forks in the car?" He said, "That part is still a mystery." A wife complained, "You never plan anything romantic." The husband said, "That's not true. Remember that surprise date night I planned?" She said, "The one that was at a hardware store." He said, "You liked the candles though." A husband said, "Let have a mature conversation." His wife said, "About what?" He said, "Who left the cabinet open?" She said, "Not me." He said, "Not me either." They both turned and looked at the cat. The cat stared back like, "Try it." A wife asked her husband, "Do you have any idea how much I love you?" He said, "No, but I know how much food you eat from my plate." She said, "That's called sharing." He said, "It's called theft." A couple got into a tiny argument. The wife said, "I'm not talking to you." The husband said, "Finally, some peace." The wife said, "Never mind, I'm talking again." A husband asked, "If you could change one thing about me, what would it be?" The wife said, "Your memory." The husband said, "Why my memory?" The wife said, "So you'd remember the things I tell you every day." A wife said, "Honey, you're getting a little round." He said, "I prefer cuddly." She said, "That's not how fitness works." A couple was watching a scary movie. The wife said, "If a zombie outbreak happened, we'd survive, right?" The husband said, "Of course." She said, "How?" He said, "Because zombies eat brains." She elbowed him and said, "Say sorry." A wife told her husband, "Stop leaving your socks everywhere." He said, "They're not everywhere." She said, "There is a sock on the microwave." He said, "Okay, that one's weird." A wife came home from work and found her husband standing in the kitchen staring at the oven like it owed him money. She asked, "What are you doing?" He said, "The lasagna instructions said heat in oven 30 minutes. She said, "Okay." He said, "But it didn't say if that counts the preheating." She said, "It doesn't matter that much." He whispered, "Cooking is harder than war." A couple was trying to take a selfie together. The wife kept saying, "Closer." He moved closer. Closer. He moved even closer. Closer. He said, "If I get any closer, we'll fuse into one person." She said, "Perfect, then we'll finally match." A husband accidentally used his wife's expensive shampoo. She stared at him, horrified. He said, "It's just soap." She said, "That soap costs more than your haircut." He said, "Then my hair should look amazing now." She said, "It won't." A wife said, "I think we should be more spontaneous." The husband nodded. An hour later he announced, "I bought us matching pajamas." She stared at him and said, "That's not spontaneity, that's chaos." A husband and wife went grocery shopping together. The wife said, "Stick to the list." The husband nodded. 5 minutes later, he had ice cream, chips, cheese balls, and a giant box of cookies. The wife said, "This was not on the list." He said, "But my heart said yes." A wife woke up in the middle of the night and said, "I heard something." Her husband sat up, terrified. He said, "What did you hear?" She said, "Probably nothing, go check." He said, "Why me?" She said, "Because if something is down there, you're expendable." He whispered, "I knew marriage had risks." A husband asked his wife, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "Nothing." He said, "You're lying." She said, "Fine, I'm thinking about how you load the dishwasher wrong." He said, "There is no wrong way." She said, "There absolutely is." A couple was watching TV when the wife said, "Pause it, I need to tell you something." The husband paused the show. 40 minutes later she said, "Okay, continue." He said, "I forgot what we were watching." A husband tried to surprise his wife with breakfast in bed. He made toast, eggs, and coffee. On the way to the bedroom he tripped, spilled half of it, and burned his finger. He walked in holding a slightly bent tray and said, "Surprise." His wife smiled and said, "It's perfect, because you tried." A wife asked her husband, "If I gained a lot of weight, would you still love me?" The husband said, "Of course I would." She said, "Would you still be attracted to me?" He said, "Of course I." She said, "Are you hesitating?" He said, "I'm choosing my words very carefully." A husband was putting together a new shelf. He said, "Honey, I need a screwdriver." His wife said, "Flathead or Phillips?" He said, "The one that turns screws." She stared at him. He stared back. She said, "We live in two different worlds." A wife came home and found her husband reorganizing the entire living room. The couch was sideways, the TV was on a chair, and all the cushions were gone. She said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "The feng shui was off." She said, "You don't even know what feng shui is." He said, "No, but the Wi-Fi was weak." A husband proudly showed his wife a new tool he bought. She said, "Why do you need that?" He said, "Because maybe one day I will need it." She said, "You said that 2 years ago when you bought the ladder and you've used it once." He said, "And it was a glorious moment." A couple sat on the couch looking at old photos. The wife said, "Remember when we used to stay up all night talking?" The husband said, "Yes, and now we stay up all night turning off the lights the kids left on." A wife told her husband, "You need to be more romantic." The husband thought for a moment and said, "I can carry multiple grocery bags at once." She said, "That's not romance." He said, "It is to me." A husband walked in holding a flower. The wife said, "Orwa, is that for me?" He said, "No, it's for the cat. She listens to me." A wife said, "You never notice the small details." The husband said, "I notice lots of things." She said, "Okay, then what color are my eyes?" He stared at her deeply for a moment and said, "Pretty." She sighed. A couple was arguing about leftovers. The wife said, "Why didn't you eat the pasta?" The husband said, "Because it looked suspicious." She said, "It's from yesterday." He said, "Exactly." A wife told her husband, "I want something that will make me feel younger." The husband said, "Want me to lower the lights?" She said, "Want me to raise the volume?" A husband walked into the bedroom holding a box. His wife said, "What's that?" He said, "A surprise." She opened it and found a note that said, "Smile." She said, "Where's the surprise?" He said, "Your smile." She said, "I want a refund." A couple was sitting quietly when the wife suddenly said, "You don't compliment me anymore." The husband said, yes, I do. She said, then say something nice right now. He said, you exist beautifully. She said, try again. A wife said, you take too long to get ready. The husband said, I take too long, you take too long. She said, I'm waiting for you. He said, I'm waiting for you. They stared at each other. Then they realized. They were both waiting on the dog to put his harness on. A husband proudly hung a picture frame on the wall. It was crooked. Very crooked. The wife stared at it silently. He said, don't say it. She said, I'm not saying anything. He said, your silence is judging me. A wife said, do you know what I want for my birthday? Her husband said, what? She said, for you to understand hints. The husband said, okay, give me a hint on how to understand hints. A couple was trying to decide where to go for dinner. The wife said, anywhere is fine. The husband said, okay, pizza. She said, no. He said, burgers. No. Sushi. No. He said, you said anywhere. She said, anywhere that's not those. A wife asked her husband, do you remember our anniversary? He said, yes. She said, when is it? He said, today. She said, no. He said, tomorrow. She said, stop guessing. A husband left a pile of clothes on the floor. His wife said, is this the new laundry basket? He said, it's temporary storage. She said, for what? He said, decisions. A wife asked, do you love me even when I'm angry? The husband said, I love you especially when you're angry. She asked, why? He said, because then I know you're alive. A couple was at the movies. The wife whispered, I'm cold. The husband gave her his jacket. She whispered, you're so sweet. He whispered, I'm also freezing, but I'm committed to this role. A wife said, why do you always assume I'm mad? He said, because last time you were quiet for that long, the house got cleaned 3 times out of stress. A husband said, I think we should have a code word for when you're angry. The wife said, okay, the code word is your name. A couple was watching a documentary about penguins. The wife said, penguins stay together for life, isn't that sweet? The husband said, yes, but they don't have to argue about thermostat settings. The wife said, if penguins had thermostats, they'd argue too. A husband tried to give his wife a foot massage. 30 seconds in, she said, you're doing it wrong. He said, how can I be doing it wrong already? She said, you're using your palms. He said, they're connected to my hands. She said, try again. A wife walked into the living room holding her phone and said, explain this. The husband froze like a statue. She said, why did you Google how to apologize nicely? He said, for a friend. She said, which friend? He said, myself. A husband came home with flowers. The wife smiled and asked, what did you do? He said, why do you think I did something? She said, you only bring flowers when you feel guilty. He said, fine, I accidentally shrunk your sweater. She said, the pink one. He said, it's more like a kid's sweater now. A wife asked her husband, who's your favorite person in the world? He said, you. She said, now who's your second favorite? He said, also you. She said, you're avoiding the question. He said, I'm trying not to die. A husband and wife were deciding what to eat for dinner. The husband said, let's order pizza. The wife said, we had pizza last week. The husband said, so. She said, so we need variety. He said, okay, order a different shaped pizza. A husband whispered to his wife, I love you even when you're grumpy. She said, I'm not grumpy. He said, you just proved my point. A wife said to her husband, you take the longest showers. He said, that's my thinking time. She said, then you should come out smarter. A husband asked his wife, why do you get mad when I clean? She said, because you clean in the wrong order. He said, there's an order. She said, always. A couple was assembling a table together. The husband said, can you hand me the thing? The wife said, the what? The thing. There are 12 things here. The metal thing. The big one or the small one? The medium one. She said, I'm calling a professional. A wife said, I feel like you don't appreciate everything I do. The husband said, that's not true, I appreciate you a lot. She said, then say something heartfelt. He took a deep breath and said, your ability to find things I lose is magical. A husband walked into the room and said, guess what? The wife said, what? He said, I fixed the door. She said, it wasn't broken. He said, it squeaked. She said, it didn't. He said, well, it doesn't now. A wife asked her husband, if I got a haircut, would you notice? He said, of course. She said, what if I dyed it? He said, definitely. She said, what if I shaved it all off? He said, please don't test me. A couple was arguing about whether to get a dog. The wife wanted one. The husband said they weren't ready. She said, you said the same thing before we had kids. He said, and I was right then too. A husband looked at the messy living room and said, we should clean. The wife said, we or me. He said, teamwork. She said, then start. He said, I meant emotional teamwork. A wife said, we need to cut back on snacks. The husband nodded while secretly hiding chips behind his back like a criminal. The wife said, what's behind your back? He said, regret. A husband asked his wife, why do you always leave the cabinet doors open? She said, so I can see all my options. He said, your options are chaos. The wife came home with shopping bags. The husband said, did you buy anything unnecessary? She said, everything I bought was necessary. He asked, then why are there shoes in the bag? She said, don't question my necessities. A husband saw his wife trying on dresses. He said, you look beautiful. She said, you didn't even look. He said, my heart looked. She said, try again. A wife called her husband at work. She said, the washing machine is making weird noises. He said, did you overload it? She said, I overloaded myself today, and you don't hear me complaining. He said, I'll be home soon. A couple was taking a walk when the wife said, isn't this romantic? The husband said, yes, as long as we don't talk about bills. She said, you just ruined it. A husband said, I think the microwave is broken. The wife asked, why? He said, it doesn't light up anymore. She walked over and turned on the kitchen light. The microwave worked perfectly. The husband whispered, technology is confusing. A wife told her husband, you never listen to me. He said, I do listen. She said, okay, what did I ask you yesterday? He said, that depends. What answer won't get me in trouble? A husband tried to fix a light bulb by standing on a wobbly chair. The wife said, get down, you'll break your neck. He said, I won't. The chair creaked loudly. His wife said, I'll go grab the ladder and a bandage. A wife said, I need you to take initiative. The husband said, okay. He sat quietly for a moment and proudly said, I took initiative. The wife said, in what? He said, in thinking about taking initiative. A couple was discussing their plans for the weekend. The wife said, we should visit my mother. The husband said, do we have to? She said, we visited your mother last time. He said, my mother feeds me cookies. She said, my mother feeds you criticism. He said, exactly. A wife asked her husband, if I lost my memory, would you help me remember our love? He said, of course. She said, what would you tell me first? He said, to stop leaving your coffee cups everywhere. She said, that is not romantic. He said, it's honest. A husband said, why do you squeeze the toothpaste from the middle? The wife said, why do you care? He said, because it creates chaos. She said, chaos builds character. A wife asked her husband, would you still love me if I had bad breath? He said, yes. She said, would you still kiss me? He said, I'd have to think about that one. A couple was trying to pick a new couch. The husband said, this one is comfortable. The wife said, but it's not aesthetically pleasing. The husband said, I don't need aesthetics, I need nappability. A husband said, let's make a budget. The wife said, okay. 5 minutes later, they both sat silently staring at a piece of paper full of crossed-out ideas. She said, let's try again next year. A wife asked her husband, why do you always forget what I told you? He said, my brain deletes things automatically. She said, why does it delete my things? He said, it thinks it's helping. A couple was looking at paint samples. The wife said, I like eggshell. The husband said, that's white. She said, no, that's eggshell. He said, it's white wearing a hat. A husband said, let's spice up date night. The wife got excited. He brought out board games. She said, this is not what I meant. He said, it's what I meant. A wife came home and saw her husband eating cereal straight from the box with a giant wooden spoon. She said, what are you doing? He said, saving dishes. She said, but now I have to wash the spoon. He said, not if you believe in me. A husband told his wife, I read that good communication is the foundation of a strong marriage. His wife said, great, let's practice. He said, okay, you start. She talked for 10 minutes straight. He nodded thoughtfully and said, I feel our marriage has grown. She said, you didn't hear a word I said. He said, I heard the vibe. A wife asked, why do you always fall asleep when we watch movies? The husband said, I don't fall asleep, I rest my eyes. She said, for 45 minutes. He said, that's how long they need. A couple went to a couples workshop. The instructor said, hold hands and stare into each other's eyes. The husband and wife did it for 3 seconds before the husband whispered, is this long enough? The instructor said, you might need extra sessions. A wife told her husband, stop putting things in the junk drawer. He said, it's not a junk drawer, it's a mystery drawer. She opened it and found batteries, a spoon, 3 nails, tape, and a sock. She said, a mystery indeed. A husband asked his wife, why do you bring snacks everywhere? She said, in case I get hungry. He said, you're always hungry. She said, and I am always prepared. A wife said to her husband, why do you always say 5 more minutes when I ask you to get ready? He said, because 5 more minutes is the international measurement of hope. A couple was debating where to put the new lamp. The wife said, it should go by the couch. The husband said, it should go by the window. They argued for 10 minutes. Then the wife said, fine, put it by the window. He said, actually, now I like the couch idea. She said, you're exhausting. A wife said, honey, you're not listening to me. The husband said, yes, I am. She said, okay, what did I say? He said something about lamps. She said, we are talking about dinner. A husband said, I think we should start exercising together. The wife said, great idea. The next day she did yoga while he sat on the mat eating a granola bar. She said, this is not exercising. He said, I'm carb loading. A wife said, do you want to try something new tonight? The husband said, sure. She brought out a 500-piece puzzle. He said, this is not what I imagined. She said, this is intimacy. A couple was trying to fix a clogged drain. The wife said, call someone. The husband said, I can handle this. 30 minutes later, the sink made a strange gurgling noise and spit water at him. He said, this is personal now. A wife asked her husband, how do I look? He paused too long. She said, why aren't you answering? He said, I'm buffering. A husband tried to surprise his wife with a home-cooked meal. He filled the kitchen with steam, smoke, and confusion. His wife walked in and said, do you need help? He said, no, I need a fire extinguisher. A wife said, stop leaving your shoes in the hallway. The husband said, they're not in the hallway. She pointed directly at them. He said, that's the edge of the hallway. She said, it's the hallway. He said, we need a hallway map. A husband asked his wife, if you could have any power, what would it be? She said, ability to read minds. He said, no thank you. She said, I didn't offer it to you. A wife said, we should go camping. The husband said, why sleep outside when we have a bed inside? She said, for the experience. He said, I prefer experiences with pillows. A husband walked around the house, turning off lights. His wife said, why do you do that? He said, because electricity isn't free. She said, neither is therapy, but you still stress me out. A couple was arguing about who snores louder. The wife said, you snore like a chainsaw. The husband said, you snore like a dragon with allergies. They stared at each other. Then they both laughed because both were true. A wife asked, why do you always eat my leftovers? The husband said, because I love you. She said, that makes no sense. He said, it does in my stomach. A husband asked his wife, why are you mad? She said, I'm not mad. He said, you're definitely mad. She said, I'm not mad, I'm disappointed. He whispered, that's worse. A wife told her husband, you forgot our shopping list at home. He said, we'll remember. 2 hours later, they were in the checkout line with items they didn't need and none of the things they did. She said, we should have gone home for the list. He said, no, this is adventure shopping. A husband walked into the room and announced, I cleaned the garage. His wife said, wow. He said, well, I cleaned half. She said, which half? He said, the half you don't look at. A wife asked her husband, do you think you're funny? He said, I know I'm funny. She said, well, you're not. He said, I'm hilarious in my mind. A husband said, I organized your side of the closet. The wife gasped and said, you what? He said, I thought you'd be happy. She said, you reorganized chaos. Chaos needs freedom. A wife asked, why did you buy so many snacks? The husband said, to prepare for emergencies. She said, what emergencies? He said, hunger. A couple was at a restaurant when the waiter asked, would you like dessert? The wife said, yes. The husband said, no. The wife looked at him. He looked at her. He said, I'll take dessert. A wife told her husband, we need to talk. He said, can it wait? She said, no. He said, can it be short? She said, no. He said, I'll get comfortable. A husband said, why are you mad at me? The wife said, I'm not mad, I'm just explaining loudly. A couple was baking cookies together. The wife carefully measured everything. The husband said, or we could eyeball it. 20 minutes later, the cookies were flat as pancakes. The wife said, we eyeballed wrong. A wife said, can you put the dishes away? The husband said, "Where?" She said, "In the cabinets." He opened the cabinets and froze. He whispered, "There are too many options." A husband proudly fixed a leaky faucet. He said, "There, it's done." 5 seconds later, the faucet leaked again. The wife said, "Want to try again?" He said, "No, the faucet needs time to think about what it's done." A couple was discussing their weekend plans. The wife said, "We should visit your parents." The husband said, "Why?" She said, "Because they miss you." He said, "They miss you more." She said, "Impossible." A wife said, "Do you know what I want for dinner?" The husband said, "Food." She said, "Correct, next question." A husband said, "Let's try budgeting again this month." The wife said, "Okay, what's the first step?" He said, "Stop buying coffee." She stared at him. He said, "Okay, step one is rethink step one." A wife said, "Honey, I think we should have a date night." The husband said, "Sounds good, when?" She said, "Friday." He said, "But Friday is my resting day." She said, "Rest while loving me." A husband told his wife, "You're my favorite person." The wife said, "Who's second?" He said, "No one, there is no second." She said, "This better be true." He whispered, "It is, depending on the day." A husband walked into the kitchen and found his wife staring at the fridge with the door wide open. He asked, "What are you looking for?" She said, "Answers." He said, "To what?" She said, "I don't know, that's why I'm looking." A wife said to her husband, "You need to be more romantic." The husband thought about it, left the room, came back with a rose and said, "Behold." The wife said, "You picked that from our garden." He said, "I harvested love." A couple was getting ready for bed when the wife said, "Honey, can you check if the door is locked?" The husband said, "Pretty sure it is." She said, "Pretty sure isn't enough." He said, "Pretty sure is the level we live at." She stared. He sighed and got up. He said, "Fine, I will upgrade to certain." A husband tried meditation for the first time. His wife said, "How does it feel?" He said, "I feel calm." She said, "Good." He said, "But my calm has questions." A wife came home with new pillows. The husband said, "Why do we need more pillows?" She said, "These are decorative." He said, "For what?" She said, "Decoration." He said, "We sleep on the bed, not decorate it." She said, "We do both." A couple was trying to decide who should do the dishes. The wife said, "Rock, paper, scissors." The husband said, "Best out of one." She said, "Best out of three." He said, "You always win those." She said, "Then maybe try harder." A wife asked her husband, "If I made a movie, would you watch it?" He said, "Of course." She said, "Even if it was boring?" He said, "I already watch your TikTok recaps. I'm trained." A husband came home holding a mysterious bag. His wife said, "What's in the bag?" He said, "Tools." She said, "Why are you smiling?" He said, "Because these tools have unknown potential." She said, "So do mistakes." A wife asked her husband, "Why are you eating cereal at 11 p.m.? He said, "Because cereal doesn't judge me." She said, "I'm judging you." He said, "That's why I didn't make you cereal." A couple was redecorating the living room. The wife said, "Let's move the couch." The husband said, "Where?" She said, "Somewhere else." He said, "That narrows it down." A husband said to his wife, "I'm finally getting in shape." She said, "Round is a shape." He said, "That hurt." A wife asked, "Why did you buy 10 bananas?" The husband said, "They were on sale." She said, "But they'll all ripen at the same time." He said, "Then we will be a banana family." A husband said, "I cleaned the whole house today." The wife said, no, you didn't. He said, I clean the parts that matter. She said, which parts? He said, the parts I see. A couple got into a small argument. The wife said, I'm done talking. The husband said, great. She said, not great for you. A wife was ordering food online. She asked, what do you want to eat? The husband said, something with cheese. She said, that's not helpful. He said, cheese is always helpful. A husband told his wife, I think we need a vacation. She said, where should we go? He said, somewhere peaceful. She said, like the backyard. He said, without the neighbors. A wife said, you forgot to compliment me today. The husband said, you look amazing. She said, that doesn't count now. He said, time shouldn't matter. She said, it does. A couple was lying in bed when the wife said, are you asleep? The husband said, I was. She said, good, because I need to talk. A husband told his wife, you're right. The wife said, about what? He said, everything. She said, this feels suspicious. A wife caught her husband trying to fix the vacuum cleaner. She said, be careful. He said, I know what I'm doing. 1 minute later he said, I no longer know what I'm doing. A husband said, let's switch chores for a day. The wife said, okay. After 1 hour, the husband was lying on the floor exhausted. She said, welcome to my world. He said, your world is aggressive. A wife asked her husband, why are you staring at your phone like that? He said, autocorrect betrayed me again. She said, in what message? He said, the one I sent you. She said, oh, I wondered why you wrote I loaf you. He said, just think of it as delicious love. A couple was choosing a movie. The wife said, not action. The husband said, not drama. The wife said, not horror. The husband said, not romance. They scrolled for an hour and went to bed. A husband asked his wife, what did you buy? She said, nothing. He said, then why are there bags? She said, the store gave them to me for fun. A wife said, I reorganized the pantry. The husband opened the door. He said, where is everything? She said, organized. He said, I liked it when it was chaos. She said, I know. A couple was preparing dinner together. The wife said, hand me the olive oil. The husband grabbed vegetable oil. She said, that's vegetable oil. He said, oil is oil. She said, this is why you're not allowed to cook. A husband wrapped a gift for his wife in newspaper. She said, why didn't you use gift wrap? He said, it's environmentally friendly. She said, it's ugly. He said, environmentally ugly. A wife said, you always leave the toothpaste cap off. The husband said, I do not. She held up the toothpaste with the cap missing. He said, that's someone else. She said, we live alone. A husband asked his wife, why are you mad? She said, I'm not mad. He said, then why are you whispering your anger? She said, because shouting is too easy. A couple was taking a walk when the husband said, I smell barbecue. The wife said, we're outside, of course you smell something. He said, let's find it. She said, we're not crashing someone's barbecue. He said, we can just stand nearby and smell respectfully. A wife said, honey, we need to be more spontaneous. An hour later, the husband said, pack your bags. She gasped. He said, we're going to the grocery store without a list. She said, that's not fun spontaneity. A husband said, I can cook dinner. He made pasta. No sauce. Just pasta. His wife stared at it and said, what is this? He said, minimalism. A couple was discussing chores. The wife said, I did the laundry, the dishes, and the cleaning. The husband said, I supported you emotionally. She said, try supporting me physically. A wife asked her husband, if we swapped roles for a day, what would you do first? He said, nap. She said, I don't nap. He said, that's the problem. A husband told his wife, I think we should buy a new mattress. She said, why? He said, because the current one remembers your anger. A wife said, I want breakfast in bed. The husband said, I want to sleep in. She said, we can compromise. He said, how? She said, you get up and make breakfast, and I'll stay in bed. He said, that's not compromise. She said, it is for me. A wife told her husband, you're lucky I love you. He said, I know. She said, say something nice back. He said, you're lucky too. She said, try again. A husband walked into the bedroom and saw his wife packing a suitcase. He said, where are you going? She said, on a trip. He said, where? She said, somewhere peaceful. He said, can I come? She said, then it won't be peaceful. A wife asked her husband, why do you always take forever in the bathroom? He said, it's my office. She said, your office. He said, the only room where nobody interrupts me. She said, I'm interrupting you right now. He said, this office is getting shut down. A couple was watching a cooking show. The wife said, I want to try making that. The husband said, great idea. She said, why don't you cook it? He said, I meant you should try making it. She said, I knew that great idea felt suspicious. A husband told his wife, I bought a new tool today. She said, what for? He said, for fixing things. She said, what things? He said, I'll let you know when they break. A wife asked her husband, why did you put the remote in the fridge? He said, I didn't. She held it up. He stared at it for 3 seconds and said, I plead tiredness. A husband proudly said, honey, I did the dishes. The wife looked in the sink and asked, where are the pots? He said, those are dishes with ambition. A wife told her husband, you're terrible at multitasking. He said, that's not true. She said, name one time you multitasked. He said, I breathed while blinking. She said, you're impossible. A husband came into the living room holding 2 nearly identical shirts. He asked, which one should I wear? The wife said, they look the same. He said, exactly, that's why I need your help. A couple was driving together when the GPS said, turn left. The husband turned right. The wife said, why didn't you listen? He said, the GPS doesn't know my heart. A wife asked her husband, do you think I'm dramatic? He gasped loud enough to scare the dog. She said, that answers my question. A couple was grocery shopping. The wife said, stick to the list. 5 minutes later, the husband came back with cookies, donuts, and a giant jar of pickles. The wife said, this isn't on the list. He said, but they spoke to me. She said, did you speak back? He said, emotionally. A husband asked his wife, why do you always take my hoodies? She said, because they're cozy. He said, so are yours. She said, yours are cozier. He said, they're cozy on me. She said, not anymore. A couple was in the kitchen when the wife said, please pass me the butter. The husband handed her a spoon. She said, this is a spoon. He said, butter is for spreading, spoons spread. She said, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. A wife said, let's play a game where we share our dreams. The husband said, okay, my dream is to take a nap. She said, no, bigger dreams. He said, fine, 2 naps. A husband told his wife, I'm going to start eating healthier. An hour later, she saw him eating a cookie. She said, what happened? He said, the cookie happened. A wife asked her husband, why did you leave the light on? He said, because I might come back. She said, when? He said, I haven't decided. A couple sat down to talk about finances. The wife said, we need to stop spending money on things we don't need. The husband nodded and whispered, goodbye, snacks. She said, not snacks, your gadgets. He gasped. She said, see, that reaction proves it. A husband tried to surprise his wife by reorganizing the kitchen. She walked in, froze, and said, where is everything? He said, organized. She said, no, hidden, everything is hidden. A wife asked her husband, why did you set your alarm for 5 a.m.? He said, so I can wake up early and be productive. She said, did you get up? He said, no, but the alarm did its part. A husband was looking through the fridge and yelled, honey, where's the milk? She yelled back, top shelf. He said, I don't see it. She walked in, pointed to it, and said, if it were a snake, it would bite you. He said, if it were a snake, I would have looked harder. A wife caught her husband eating ice cream out of the container. She said, use a bowl. He said, the bowl slows the experience. A husband said, let's take a romantic walk. His wife said, where? He said, to the fridge. She said, you need help. A wife told her husband, stop leaving your towel on the floor. He said, I don't leave it, I put it there. She said, why? He said, so gravity feels included. A husband asked his wife, what should we make for dinner? She said, something light. He opened the fridge and held up a grape. She said, try again. A wife said, you forgot to water the plants. The husband said, they look fine. She held up a dry, wilting plant. He said, that one's faking it. A couple was watching the sunset. The wife said, this is so beautiful. The husband said, yeah. She said, what are you thinking about? He said, how many chicken wings I could eat right now. She said, romance is dead. A wife asked her husband, why do you take so long at the store? He said, because I wander. She said, why? He said, because I'm free inside grocery stores. A husband said to his wife, I washed the car. She said, nice. He said, and by washed, I mean it rained. She said, we are different people. A wife bought a new candle and said, smell this. The husband sniffed it. She said, do you like it? He said, it smells like candle. She said, you have the nose of a potato. A husband told his wife, I want to be more spontaneous. The wife said, great. An hour later, he walked in wearing mismatched socks and a hat he found under the couch. She said, this is not spontaneity, this is concern. A wife asked her husband, why are you staring at the wall? He said, thinking. She said, about what? He said, nothing. She said, then why think? He said, to organize the nothing. A husband came home, excited. He said, guess what? I saved money today. The wife said, how? He said, I didn't buy the thing I wanted. She said, that's not saving money. He said, it feels like it. A wife asked her husband, what do you want for your birthday? He said, peace. She said, be realistic. He said, snacks. She said, that's realistic. A wife walked into the living room and found her husband holding a broom like a guitar. She said, what are you doing? He said, practicing. She said, practicing what? He said, being a rock star. She said, you could practice sweeping instead. He said, that's an entirely different kind of performance. A husband tried to flirt with his wife by winking at her from across the room. She squinted and said, why are you blinking weirdly? He said, I'm flirting. She said, oh, it looked like you were having a contact lens emergency. A wife asked her husband, if you won the lottery, what's the first thing you buy? He said, a bigger TV. She said, what about me? He said, you can watch the TV. She said, try again. A couple was sitting in silence when the wife suddenly said, you know what bothers me? The husband whispered, this list is going to be long. A husband walked into the kitchen and said, I'm hungry. His wife said, there's food in the fridge. He opened the fridge, stared at it for 45 seconds and said, I don't see anything. She walked over, grabbed leftovers, put them in his hand and said, congratulations, you found food. A wife asked her husband, why do men leave cabinet doors open? He said, why do women notice everything? She said, because we're the ones who close the cabinet doors. A couple was at a restaurant when the waiter asked, soup or salad? The husband said, soup or salad. The waiter said, soup or salad? The husband said, yes. His wife covered her face and whispered, we will never eat here again. A wife told her husband, you need to go to the doctor. He said, I'm fine. She said, you cough every time you inhale. He said, that's air-related. A husband proudly put up a curtain rod. It was crooked, very crooked. The wife walked in and said nothing. He said, don't you dare say it. She whispered, gravity hates you. A wife said, honey, fold the laundry. The husband said, I don't know how to fold fitted sheets. She said, nobody does, just do your best. He rolled it into a ball. She stared at it. He said, it has character. A couple was watching a romantic movie. The wife said, why don't you ever do things like that? The husband said, we don't have a movie budget. She said, romance doesn't need a budget. He said, mine does. A husband asked his wife, why are you making that face? She said, this is my listening face. He said, it looks angry. She said, that's because I'm listening to you. A wife picked up her husband's laundry and said, why are there socks everywhere? He said, I like to leave them where inspiration strikes. She said, then inspiration needs therapy. A husband walked into the living room and said, I cleaned. The wife said, what exactly did you clean? He said, the vibe. A wife told her husband, you need to hydrate more. He held up his coffee and said, this is hydration. She said, that's caffeine. He said, caffeine is emotional hydration. A husband woke up and said, I had the weirdest dream. His wife said, tell me. He said, you were chasing me with a vacuum. She said, that wasn't a dream. He said, wait, what? A wife asked, did you fix the sink? The husband said, yes. She turned it on, and water sprayed across the kitchen like a fountain. She looked at him. He said, it's a water feature. A husband told his wife, we should get matching tattoos. She said, of what? He said, snacks. She said, why snacks? He said, because they unite us. A wife said, you never help me make decisions. The husband said, yes, I do. She said, okay, left or right? He said, yes. She said, see, nothing helpful. A couple was picking out paint colors. The wife held up 3 shades of beige. She said, which one do you like? The husband said, they look identical. She gasped and said, how dare you? A husband walked into the bedroom and saw his wife journaling. He asked, what are you writing? She said, my thoughts. He said, am I in there? She said, next question. A wife asked, why did you put the broom in the shower? The husband said, to wash it. She said, that's not how anything works. He said, it's how innovation works. A husband said, honey, look, I fixed the lamp. She said, how? He said, I tightened everything. She turned it on, and it flickered like a horror movie scene. She said, it's possessed now. He said, but solidly possessed. A wife asked her husband, do you remember what tomorrow is? He froze, blinking, sweating. She said, relax, it's garbage day. He said, I knew that, totally knew that. A couple was assembling furniture. The wife said, follow the instructions. The husband said, instructions are suggestions. 20 minutes later, the table had 3 legs on one side. The wife said, is this a suggestion too? He said, the table is expressing itself. A wife asked, why are you eating cake at 9 a.m.? The husband said, because it's someone's birthday somewhere. She said, that's not how time zones work. He said, it is for cake. A husband said, let's do a spa night. The wife said, sure. He came into the living room wearing a bathrobe, cucumber slices on his eyes, and holding a bowl of popcorn. She said, why popcorn? He said, spa but with snacks. A wife told her husband, you're impossible sometimes. He said, only sometimes. She said, don't push it. A husband asked, do we really need this many throw blankets? The wife said, yes. He said, why? She said, for coziness. He said, but we have heating. She said, not emotional heating. A wife saw her husband wearing her slippers. She said, why are you wearing those? He said, comfort chooses no owner. A husband said, I read online that happy couples communicate clearly. The wife said, okay, communicate something. He said, I'm hungry. She said, try something deeper. He said, I'm deeply hungry. A couple was arguing lightly when the wife said, we don't need to fight. The husband said, we're not fighting, we're passionately disagreeing. She said, why are you passionately wrong then? A wife asked her husband, why did you eat the last cookie? He said, I didn't know it was the last. She said, it was sitting alone in the container. He said, that makes it a survivor. A husband told his wife, I bought us tickets. She said, to what? He said, a mystery event. She said, did you even read what you bought? He said, no, it was on sale. A wife said, I had a dream you bought me jewelry. The husband said, that was your dream. She said, so. He said, I'm not responsible for dream spending. A couple was driving when the wife said, watch out for that pothole. The husband said, I saw it. She said, then why didn't you avoid it? He said, because it was fate. A wife asked her husband, why do you always lose your keys? He said, because they enjoy adventure. She said, they enjoy ruining my morning.